Killing comes easily to those without feelings. A houseguest takes pleasure in the pain of her hosts.
Just a very cold, calculating individual.
A poor immigrant has evil designs on her neighbor's life.
She's able to pull off this unbelievable crime. Who's that?
And a loving mother makes murder a family affair.
Gary!
They left him for dead in the ditch.
Hattiesburg, Mississippi, 2004.
They're here!
After years apart, a family reunion. 29-year-old Roger Gillette
Howdy, cousin. Good to see you.
is catching up with his cousin, Vernon Hullett.
Good to see you too.
They grew up together. They knew each other well, so they were very comfortable with each other. He was glad to see his cousin, but he wasn't expecting Lisa Joe.
This is Linda.
Hi, lovely to meet you both.
This is Lisa.
Hi.
31-year-old Lisa Joe Chamberlain is Roger's new flame.
Now, Linda, I hope you don't mind us staying.
Your family.
Vernon's also in love with 37-year-old Linda Heinzelman.
Linda was a sweet, unassuming, simple, young woman. She liked to keep house and be with Vernon.
No. Well, family means the world to us, too.
They were living kind of a quiet life. He had taken a job with the city of Hattiesburg. They, by all accounts, were a happy couple.
But Vernon and Linda have no idea who they are letting stay in their home.
Don't answer so fast.
Excuse me?
No, you know, and I know.
Lisa was very jealous of any women that were around and was very pushy about Linda. Didn't like her at all, basically.
Lisa Joe's one skill is cooking methamphetamine.
She would make it, he would sell it. He was a salesman type guy, very polished as a con man, and they just seemed to hit it off.
Roger would get into trouble, not take responsibility, and relatives would bail him out of trouble. What they didn't realize is that every time they bailed him out of a problem, they bought him his next criminal act.
Hey, baby.
Another criminal act is the real reason behind the family reunion. Lisa Joe and Roger are on the run from drug charges in Kansas City.
He was planning on staying for a few days, get some money from Vernon, and then he and Lisa Joe would go on to Mexico.
In a bid for quick cash, they entice cousin Vernon into helping with an insurance scam.
I don't know.
What's the problem? The only loser is the insurance company.
And screw them, right?
And they were going to basically stage a vehicle accident with Lisa's car and Linda's pickup.
Nah. Linda will never go for it.
Look, once we stage the accident, she won't have any choice.
Linda was not going to cooperate with them claiming an insurance scam on her insurance.
No way. I'm not doing this.
She didn't like living that style. She liked doing things honest.
Linda, it's easy.
I said no.
Well, what about my car? I can't even drive it.
I'm sorry.
Lisa Joe is not the kind of person that rolls with the punches.
So much for being nice.
She's going to be looking for people to blame. And she's not going to find her in the mirror.
Lisa was the driving force and kind of came up with a lot of the ideas of what they were going to do.
She comes up with an even darker plan to make money.
Hey, Vernon, I've been thinking. How would you like to be a partner in a small business?
Lisa and Roger were bad to the bone.
You mean the meth business?
Why not?
Vernon didn't want any part of it.
He wanted to move forward and be productive and to start a family.
I think it's time you both left.
You had two individuals that basically were used to always getting what they wanted.
Something was going to happen, and something did.
By March 20th, 2004, Vernon has had enough of Lisa Jo and Roger. But they're not prepared to leave empty-handed.
What are you doing?
A couple of beers to the road.
Put him back.
They resorted to what they knew best, being evil and mean.
That is it. Get out of my house!
Oh, we're leaving, all right. But not without your pickup and the money.
Lisa Jo and Roger truly were a match made in hell.
What money?
The money in the safe!
There's no money in there.
Lisa Jo felt that there was money in that safe, that he was keeping money there, and they wanted that money.
They are prepared to do whatever it takes to get the combination.
It turned into just an actual fury of blind rage. The stabbing, the slashing, that brutal assault.
And it just kept getting worse and worse. Linda was watching the man that she loved getting tortured.
Give us the combination!
Vernon.
They finally hit Vernon in the head with a hammer.
You could have made this easy on yourself, couldn't you?
It actually bent the metal handle of the hammer.
So it was a house of horrors, if you will, for a few hours.
It's not that difficult to kill someone.
Finish him off.
But that isn't what Lisa Jo and Roger wanted. They wanted to party, and partying to them meant hurting other people. Torture.
No. Please.
That cut his throat, and he bled out.
But they still don't have what they want. So they turn on Linda.
Come on, give us the combination.
I don't know the combination.
Give it to us!
Give it to us now.
I don't know what it is.
We can do this the easy way, or we can do this the hard way!
She didn't like Linda from the beginning, and so for her to be able to torture Linda like that was satisfying to her.
I promise I don't want you please to. No!
Roger and Lisa sexually assaulted her. That turned on Lisa so much she wanted to have sex with Roger. And so they did. And Lisa said it was the best sexual experience of her life. That's really all I need to know about Lisa.
They decided to clean the home and dismember the bodies. Roger was taking too long, so she moved him out of the way and said, look, I've deer hunted I know how to dismember this body. So she took over the operation and finished dismembering the body.
They emptied out a chest freezer and put both bodies in the chest freezer.
Shut it, plugged it in, and they were froze.
Lisa Jo and Roger now break open the safe. But there is no pot of gold.
There was no money in the safe, so this whole robbery and homicide was really for nothing.
The killers load their gruesome cargo onto Cousin Vernon's pickup and drive it 1,000 miles to a farm in Russell County, Kansas, owned by another of Roger's relatives.
He felt that he could hide back here and get rid of the bodies.
This time, on the run from the law, with a mystery freezer on board.
Hey!
Rogers outlasted his welcome.
What are you doing?
Some of the family actually turned on Roger and gave him up.
These two should be the poster kids for this is your brain on drugs. They could have easily gotten rid of that freezer and sunk it in a lake. But no, they're carrying it around with them and talking about the bodies in the freezer.
Within days, the House of Horrors is revealed.
To have a crime this violent, of actually a double homicide, where bodies were dismembered, I mean, it does send a shock through the community.
Through the entire time, I never once saw an ounce of remorse. She did not seem to be fazed by her actions at all, and just a very cold, calculating individual.
In 2006, Lisa Jo Chamberlain and Roger Gillette are convicted of 2 counts of capital murder. They are both sentenced to death.
The deliberate torture, murder, sexual assault of 2 people is indefensible. And the people that are able to do it, or the person able to do it, should never walk among us. But I think when these 2 show up in hell, they're getting kicked right back out. Jealousy is one of the most common motives behind murder.
Cheers.
She just took what she wanted. And if someone had to die, oh well.
At the turn of the 20th century, like millions of her countrymen, Irish lass Mary Farmer immigrates to America in search of a better life.
She suffered a lot of hardship, I think, in her life, and coming to America was just going to be that fresh start, that new beginning.
By 1907, 24-year-old Mary's life is looking up. She's married with a young son, with big dreams for their future in Jefferson County, New York.
Now she had this young son.
Don't worry, me love. You'll have better than this.
And she did not want this young son growing up to be an impoverished person.
But just when life is looking bright, Mary's luck runs out. Husband James isn't pulling his weight.
James started his job in a paper mill, and he was rather fond of drink.
You're drunk.
I've been dismissed.
No. No, not now. Not with the baby.
Her husband lost his job and crawled into a bottle.
With James out of work, things were going to go to desperate pretty quickly.
it rent day already?
Their neighbor and landlord, Sarah Brennan, is a successful Irish immigrant.
I heard about your husband. If you need more time... Of course not. I'll get it for you.
Sarah Brennan, she's snobbish, she's arrogant, she talks down to Mrs. Farmer.
Maybe lord it over Mary just a little bit. Just letting her know, our life is a little better than yours.
It won't leave you short?
There was a definite class distinction. Sarah didn't really visit Mary in her home.
Why don't you come in? Oh, I can't. Why don't you come for tea this afternoon?
Mary visited Sarah.
The visits only remind Mary of all the things she doesn't have.
Fancy.
Their house was very, very nice. All the modern luxuries at the time. They had a lot, and it was apparent.
It was my mother's.
She's very, very, very jealous of everything that Sarah had.
You have such nice things. You will too. One day.
She was doing a little bit more than sipping tea with Sarah. She was looking around and seeing where things were.
Let me show you something.
And she was able to find out where they kept their important papers.
Mrs. Brennan enjoyed her money and she enjoyed flouting her money.
This is something I'm very proud of. We finally own our home. That's my dream.
Fate has placed a golden opportunity right in front of Mary. And an audacious plan forms in her mind.
When Sarah wasn't there, Mary went into the house and stole those papers, including the deed to the property.
Armed with the stolen deed, Mary embarks on a daring deception.
Mary, even though she wasn't educated at all, came up with a kind of a sophisticated plan.
Mrs. Brennan? That's right. Sarah Brennan.
Mary went into the county records office pretending to be Sarah.
And you want to transfer ownership of the property deed?
Yes, we've sold the house to the lovely couple next door.
She had the attorney transfer title from Mrs. Brennan to herself.
Mary and James Farmer.
Small towns, usually everybody knows everybody else's business. Yet Mary comes in, she's an outsider, and she's able to pull off this unbelievable crime.
We need a signature then?
She forges Sarah's name and has it notarized. So now she's the proud owner of 2 properties, completely illegally.
So now the issue is, how do they get the Brennans out of the house?
In 1907, struggling Irish immigrants, Mary and James Farmer,
Open it.
finally have something to celebrate.
But this says...
We own the house next door?
Mary told her husband that she bought the big house from Sarah.
The Brennan's place, but how?
My uncle in Buffalo left me some money.
For an ale.
All right then.
But as the farmers celebrate, Mary knows the deal is not yet sealed.
Cheers.
If the real Sarah Brennan discovers the deed to the home is missing, Mary's thieving ways will be exposed.
That was the dilemma, because Sarah was not stupid.
Obviously, Sarah and Patrick weren't going to give Mary the house. Mary knew that.
On April 23rd, 1908, she sets out to solve the problem.
She tells Sarah she'll accompany her to the dentist.
I'm off. Where's the bub?
I told you. Mrs. Baker's looking after him today. I'm going into town with Sarah.
James went to help a relative pave a walkway. The baby, Peter, is with the sitter. So that leaves Mary and Sarah on this errand to the dentist.
It's an appointment Sarah Brennan will not keep.
Mary has a surprise for her.
Do hurry up, Mary.
Mary came up behind her and
I'll be late for the dentist.
she hit her over the head with an axe.
She just takes that hatchet and she starts hitting Sarah over and over with it. She's just raining blow after blow on Sarah, and there's a lot of pent-up rage.
In killing Sarah, Mary was ferociously destroying what she coveted. Mary put that axe right between Sarah's eyes. She hated her.
Sarah suffers a horrific death because Mary wants her lifestyle.
It was a very extreme act. And I think Mary Farmer wanted it to be a very extreme act. She didn't like that woman. She didn't like Mrs. Brennan.
There, damn you. I've done with you.
And said, there, I'm done with you.
Mary bundles Sarah's body into a large trunk and scrubs away all evidence of the murder before husband James returns. When Sarah's husband Patrick arrives home, he's locked out and there is no sign of his wife.
Patrick looks for the spare key, doesn't find the spare key in the regular hiding place.
The farmers arrive with a bizarre explanation.
What do you think you're doing?
No, I'm locked out.
Didn't she tell you? She sold your house to us.
Mary Farmer says, well, we bought the house and your wife's been paying us $2 a week rent.
Very funny.
That was news to him.
I've got the paperwork to prove it. And you're 2 weeks behind on rent. You, sir, are evicted.
Of course, Patrick was dumbstruck.
Once Mary and James successfully got Patrick evicted from his own house, they move in.
But just weeks later, Mary's devious plot begins to unravel. Patrick orders his own investigation into his wife's disappearance, starting at the county records office.
Patrick retains an attorney to look into it. What he finds out was the woman that did the trade on the title did not look like Sarah. In fact, it was a description of Mary.
And that's when people start to get suspicious. Like, okay, I wonder where Sarah really is and what happened to her.
Armed with new evidence, the local sheriff searches the farmer's new home.
Sheriff Bellinger is called in. He begins to investigate. He goes to the farmers.
What about these?
Bellinger asked about the trunks, the smaller one and the larger one.
The top one's mine, and the other must be yours.
Mary Farmer said that the smaller trunk was hers and that the larger trunk was Mr. Farmer's.
That's a damn lie.
And James is right away, oh no, it's not. That big one on the bottom, leaking fluids, that's your trunk.
Naive James doesn't think they have anything to hide.
Yes, well, I suppose the big one's mine, but I've lost the key.
Let's just let the sheriff bust it open then.
James told the police to break it open. The search for Sarah was over. The fact that James insisted the trunk be broken open indicates he had no knowledge that there was a body in the trunk and what his wife had done.
But in 1908, both Mary and James Farmer are convicted of first-degree murder and sentenced to death by electric chair.
While she's waiting to be executed, Mrs. Farmer wrote a letter claiming that her husband, James Farmer, had nothing to do with the murder of Sarah Brennan.
In March 1909, Mary is executed. But thanks to her letter, James is acquitted on appeal and walks free. But he's never reunited with their son, Peter.
And that's the saddest part of this case. When Mary and James were arrested, their little boy went to the home of a relative, but eventually ended up in an orphanage.
She had set this whole plan in motion, supposedly to spare her son any kind of a hard life, and he just got the worst outcome possible.
She actually destroyed his life.
Mary Farmer begrudged the success of others so much, she tried to take it for herself and condemned her family to a fate far worse than the poverty she wanted to escape.
Mary Farmer is a product of her environment. She's a product of the time. She could look at this other woman and say, you've got something that I want and I'm going to take it because it's the only way I can get it.
A lot of people aren't happy with what they have in life, but they don't go killing people that do have what they want. Mary's desire to live in that big house became a very, very powerful fantasy, and their life just became out of control, and this is how it ended. She had no trouble pushing people around. It was a brutal, hands-on attack, which was kind of a dream come true.
In 2015, the countryside of South Yorkshire, England, is usually a peaceful place.
Here you are, love. Take a break.
But when new landowners, 39-year-old Scott Dawson and his 69-year-old mother Carol arrive, things start to change.
Carol and Scott inherited some money, and with this money, they bought quite a large plot of land.
Who's that?
There was a popular walking trail that went through the land. The path was actually public. The public were entitled to use it. And because of the nature of the way the place was, sometimes people would actually stray from the path, which would mean that technically they were trespassing on the Dawsons' land.
Ah, jeez. I'm sick of this. Hey!
There was no doubt that in the majority of cases, these people didn't even realise that they weren't supposed to be there, but it did occasionally happen.
Public trail or not, Carol and Scott are unforgiving.
You're trespassing.
This is a public path.
Not here, it isn't.
They don't like to share.
Carol Dawson seemed like an unassuming pensioner. She was anything but.
Well, I'm looking for me dog.
Her son, Scott, was Carol on steroids.
All right.
Scott was always itching for a fight. It seems to me he was trying to prove himself, that he was the king of his domain and everybody else needed to toe the line.
Close by, but a world away. Neighbors 46-year-old Gary Dean and wife Carolyn are more congenial.
Gary was not an aggressive man in any way, shape or form. He would do everything he could.
Get away from me! Oh, come on, you love it! Eat something!
He was an avid and obsessive runner. He'd even completed 21 consecutive London marathons.
Gary had a daily routine and he used to run on the popular walking trail, which was public. But there's no doubt that part of his route would often perhaps take him onto the Dawson's land as well.
Around 2016, Scott and his mother Carol began to get very annoyed with Gary.
What's the problem? You're trespassing. It's a public path. Path's over there.
Okay then. Happy now?
The more that he did this, the more furious the Dawsons, mother and son, became.
Over time, the scenario plays out again and again. For Scott and Carol, interrupting Gary's run becomes an obsession.
They put signs up with the word "stay away" on in the land directed towards Gary Dean. They wanted their own land and they didn't want anybody else to be anywhere near it.
But it didn't do any good. This drove Scott and Carol nuts.
The mother and son declare war.
In 2017, Carol began making accusations directly to the police about Gary. He was accused of setting fires and even dumping rubbish on their land.
It's Carol Dawson again. You have to do something.
And they even suggested at one point that Gary Dean had been defecating in the area as well.
I don't care. This is the 5th time I've called you this week.
Scott and Carol would not stop.
You need to send somebody over, okay?
Carol was trying to make herself out to be the victim, when in fact, the problem was Carol and her son.
Lying to the police gets her nowhere. But Carol is willing to try anything in her arsenal to fight Gary, so she ups her smear campaign.
Gary's wife was a headmistress in a local primary school, and one day she received an anonymous letter that had been delivered to the school. A similar letter was also delivered to the dean's home address as well. That letter contained awful rumours and suggestions.
You are so wrong.
Basically trying to stoke up a bit of unrest within the community.
The author of the letters, Carol knows one lie that sticks like mud.
Carol began circulating rumours that Gary was a paedophile who lured little children into the woodlands around the path. Caroline was a schoolteacher. Sadly for Caroline, local authorities were obliged to investigate these allegations.
Gary!
When's it gonna stop?
An investigation clears Gary's name.
It pushed Carol and Scott over the top. They commenced a plan that would result in someone's death.
On September 6, 2018, in the beautiful countryside of South Yorkshire, England, Carol and her son Scott embark on an ugly vendetta.
Carol had tremendous control and influence over her adult son, Scott. They were looking for a fight.
Their target, Gary Dean. This morning is like any other, except instead of a run, Gary decides to walk his usual route.
When Gary left the home address at about 7 o'clock in the morning, he was dressed fairly casually. He wasn't wearing his running gear.
As Gary made his way along the public path, Scott and Carol were waiting on their land.
He was ambushed. He never had a chance.
First, he shot him in the back with an air rifle, and that's when things turned really violent.
He was pursued relentlessly by Scott Dawson, who then began to beat him very savagely with the butt of the rifle, with some rocks.
Use that rock.
It was a brutal, hands-on attack, which was kind of a dream come true for Scott, beating someone up in the woods. Gary never had a chance.
They left him for dead in the ditch.
Gary is guilty of nothing other than a healthy dedication to exercise. Yet his punishment, cruel slander, and a brutal death.
Gary Dean, who hadn't caused any harm to anybody and was going about his usual business, had his life tragically cut short by a pair of manipulative, aggressive individuals.
Their plan was to return later that day with a digger to dispose of the body.
Before they get the chance, passers-by come across the blood-soaked murder scene. Immediately, investigators have prime suspects.
The police had hundreds of complaints from Scott and his mother regarding the murder victim. Gee, I wonder who did this crime.
In 2019, both Scott and Carol Dawson are convicted of murder. Scott is sentenced to a minimum of 31 years. Carol receives 26 years.
The judge had some pretty harsh comments to make. He said that you both fed off the venom of each other. This toxic mixture led to murder.
Carol and Scott shared an anger at the world that festered into murderous rage. Gary literally stumbled into their path.
Carol and Scott are a study in a family conspiracy. Scott would do anything his mother wanted. Carol enabled her own son to commit an act that resulted in him going to prison pretty much for the rest of his life. What kind of mother is that?
For these deadly women, cruelty came naturally.
The phone rings just before dawn, that thin, metallic sound cutting through a quiet California morning that still smells like ocean air and asphalt cooling from the night before. And somewhere in a modest house, the receiver is lifted with a hesitation that will later feel prophetic. Because every cold case begins like this, not with sirens or headlines, but with a moment when ordinary life is interrupted by a sentence that doesn't quite land at first. A sentence that says someone didn't come home, that a door was left unlocked, that a car was found where it shouldn't be. And in 1999, in a stretch of California that prided itself on safety and routine, that interruption would echo for decades. The street looks harmless in the early light, trimmed lawns, parked sedans, the kind of place where neighbors know each other's dogs and wave without thinking. But behind one front door, the clock has stopped at a time nobody remembers setting, and inside that stillness, the absence feels louder than any noise because she was supposed to be back by midnight, because her keys are on the table, because nothing appears stolen, because there is no sign of struggle, and because the quiet is wrong, in a way that settles into the bones. By mid-morning, the word missing begins to circulate, first among family, then neighbors, then police radios crackling with clipped descriptions, age, height, clothing, last known location, and the house becomes a staging area for questions that don't yet have answers. When was the last call? Who saw her last? Did she mention anything unusual? And every response is the same: no, nothing. It was a normal day, which is the most terrifying phrase in any investigation. The community reacts the way communities always do at first, with shock wrapped in denial, with volunteers offering to search, with flyers printed in black and white and taped to lampposts, grocery store windows, bus stops, her face staring back at strangers who slow down for a second and then move on. And in those early hours, optimism still breathes, still insists that people get lost, that misunderstandings happen, that she'll walk back through the door embarrassed and tired and alive. Police canvass the area, knock on doors, check alibis that aren't yet called alibis, and they find nothing that breaks the surface of normalcy. No blood, no witnesses willing or able to say more than, "I didn't see anything." No screaming in the night. No suspicious vehicles remembered clearly enough to matter. And as the hours stretch into days, the language changes, the tone hardens, the case shifts quietly, almost imperceptibly, from missing person to something colder. The car is found several miles away, parked crooked, unlocked, an ordinary vehicle in an ordinary lot, but it feels staged, too clean, too empty, like a punctuation mark without a sentence. And inside there is no clear answer, no weapon, no obvious trace of violence, just the unsettling suggestion that someone wanted the car out of sight or wanted it to be found, and investigators stand around it in the California sun, notebooks open, instincts firing, knowing that the first days are. Everything in that time is already slipping away. Friends are interviewed, co-workers, former partners, anyone who ever crossed her path long enough to leave a memory, and each conversation adds detail, without clarity, painting a portrait of a woman who lived carefully, who kept routines, who didn't disappear easily, and the contradiction gnaws at the investigators because people like this don't just vanish, not without help, not without force, not without someone else deciding their fate. Rumors start before facts can keep up, as they always do. Whispers of arguments, of someone seen nearby, of a scream that might have been heard but wasn't recognized at the time, and police sift through it all with practiced skepticism, separating noise from signal, knowing that in the chaos of a community in shock, truth often hides behind exaggeration and fear. Days turn into weeks. The search grids widen. Helicopters sweep over scrubland and industrial edges of the city. Divers check dark water where light barely reaches, and every negative result tightens the knot in everyone's chest, because absence becomes evidence of its own, because hope starts to feel irresponsible, and because the phrase "no sign of her" begins to sound permanent. By the time the case officially cools, it does so without ceremony, no announcement, no final press conference, just fewer officers assigned, fewer calls returned, the slow, bureaucratic drift that families feel like abandonment, and the word "cold case" enters the file in neat type, reducing a life to a category that suggests patience, distance, and an indefinite wait. Years pass, and California changes in small ways. New buildings, new faces, technology advancing quietly while the file sits unchanged, photographs aging, leads exhausted, evidence boxed and labeled, and the family learns a new rhythm, one built around anniversaries and what-ifs, around news alerts that make the heart race for no reason, around living with a question that never resolves. Detectives retire, younger ones inherit the file, reading it late at night, seeing patterns their predecessors missed, or dismissing theories that once seemed promising, and each new set of eyes brings a brief resurgence of activity, a flurry of interviews, a fresh look at old evidence, followed by the same wall, the same silence that swallowed the truth years ago. The community remembers in fragments, a mural that fades, a scholarship set up in her name, a bench in a park that people pass without knowing why it's there, and the story becomes something locals reference vaguely. That case from the late 90s, the one that was never solved, a cautionary tale stripped of details, reduced to unease. Then, decades later, technology changes the rules, quietly at first, with lab techniques that can read what was once invisible, that can pull identity from microscopic traces, and a box is reopened, gloves snapped on, evidence re-examined under lights brighter than the ones used years before, and in that sterile room, history waits to be disturbed. The sample is small, almost nothing, something collected without much optimism at the time, cataloged more out of procedure than belief, but now it goes into a machine that didn't exist when the case began, and the process is methodical, impersonal, indifferent to the emotional weight attached to the result. And when the computer flags a match, the room goes quiet. The DNA doesn't answer every question, but it answers one with brutal clarity, attaching a name to a trace, connecting a person to a moment that has been frozen in time. And investigators stare at the screen, feeling that rare surge of adrenaline that comes when a cold case twitches back to life, when the impossible suddenly feels reachable. The name is not a stranger pulled from the shadows, not a faceless monster invented by fear, but someone who existed in the periphery of the original investigation, someone overlooked or cleared or simply not understood in the context of the time. And that revelation lands like a physical blow, because it reframes years of assumptions in an instant. Phones start ringing again, this time with urgency, supervisors looped in, warrants discussed, and the word solved is spoken cautiously at first, then with growing confidence, because a match is a match, because science doesn't forget, and because the case that defined a generation of unanswered questions suddenly has a focal point. But even as the headlines prepare themselves, even as investigators feel the rush of vindication and disbelief, a quieter tension hums beneath the surface, because DNA can place someone in contact, but it doesn't tell the story, it doesn't explain motive, it doesn't fill the gaps carved out by years of silence. And in that space between proof and understanding, doubt lingers. For the family, the call comes again, another interruption of ordinary life, another sentence that changes everything, and this time it carries the weight of resolution and the threat of new pain, because answers, when they arrive this late, don't heal cleanly. They reopen wounds in unfamiliar ways. The case that vanished into the late 90s is now back in the present, dragging its shadows with it. And as investigators move forward under the glare of public attention, one truth becomes impossible to ignore. Even when a cold case is declared solved, the story it leaves behind is rarely simple, rarely complete, and never without ghosts. And somewhere between the relief of a name and the unease of unanswered questions, California prepares to confront a past it thought was buried, only to discover that time doesn't erase mysteries. It only teaches them how to wait. The name doesn't echo through the newsroom the way people expect. There's no cinematic gasp, no shouted accusation, just a tightening in the room as investigators absorb what the DNA has done to the timeline. Because a match doesn't arrive with certainty, it arrives with responsibility. And suddenly the past is no longer sealed behind yellowing folders. It is standing in the present, demanding to be handled carefully. The suspect's history is pulled apart line by line. Old addresses, former jobs, relationships that once seemed insignificant now re-examined with an intensity that borders on obsession. And the first surprise is how ordinary it all looks. No long rap sheet, no dramatic spiral. Just a life lived close enough to the victim to matter and distant enough to disappear into the noise of the late 90s. Which is often how these stories hide, not in darkness, but in plain sight. Back in 1999, this person had been interviewed briefly, a few routine questions, nothing that trigger alarms, nothing that survived the pressure of a chaotic early investigation where time was thin and resources thinner. And now that old report is reread slowly, every word weighed, every omission magnified, because what once felt like a dead end now reads like a misturn. Investigators revisit the locations tied to the name. Some changed beyond recognition. others stubbornly frozen in time. And walking those streets again feels surreal, as if the city itself has been holding its breath, waiting for someone to notice what it remembers. And with every step, the sense grows that the truth didn't vanish. It was simply never pursued far enough. They knock on doors again, not with the urgency of a breaking case, but with the careful tone reserved for questions that carry legal weight. And people answer differently now, older, less guarded, some relieved to talk, others visibly uncomfortable, because time doesn't just erode memories, it reshapes loyalties, and what someone was willing to protect 20 years ago may no longer feel worth the effort. The suspect is located without drama, living a life that appears settled, predictable, and that normalcy creates its own shockwave, because the distance between who someone seems to be and what evidence suggests they may have done is where the tension truly lives. And as detectives prepare to make contact, they understand that this moment will redefine everything that comes next. The interview room is deliberately unremarkable, neutral walls, steady lighting, nothing that hints at confrontation. And when the suspect sits down, the atmosphere is calm, almost polite, questions beginning with background, with context, with harmless details designed to rebuild a timeline that has been dormant for decades. And the answers come easily at first, practiced even, as if rehearsed over years of quiet self-assurance. When the topic shifts back to 1999, there is a pause, brief but noticeable, the kind of pause investigators learn to respect, not because it proves guilt, but because it reveals awareness. And as the suspect speaks about that year, the language grows vaguer, memories blur conveniently, dates soften, and the room fills with a tension that no one acknowledges out loud. The DNA is not mentioned immediately, because seasoned detectives know that evidence has more power when it arrives at the right moment, and instead they let the story unfold, watching for cracks, listening for contradictions, comparing what is said now to what was said then, and slowly, carefully, a pattern emerges, not of confession, but of avoidance. When the match is finally disclosed, it lands quietly, deliberately, the words measured, factual, stripped of accusation, and for a fraction of a second the suspect's expression changes. Something flickers behind the eyes, not panic exactly, but calculation, and then the mask returns, calm restored, explanations offered that sound plausible on the surface but thin under scrutiny. The suspect insists on innocence, suggests contamination, coincidence, mistakes in handling evidence from an era before modern protocols, and those arguments are not dismissed outright, because investigators have learned the hard way that confidence can be as dangerous as doubt, and every claim must be tested against facts, not instinct. Outside the room, legal teams prepare, understanding that a cold case resurrected by DNA carries unique challenges, degraded samples, lost witnesses, memories warped by time, and the burden of proving not just contact, but intent, action, and responsibility, all while the public waits for a resolution that may never feel complete. News leaks despite precautions, it always does, and headlines erupt with the word solved, a declaration that feels premature to those closest to the case, because inside the investigation, nothing feels finished and the pressure intensifies, not just to confirm guilt, but to ensure that whatever comes next can survive the scrutiny of a courtroom. The family reacts with a complex mix of relief and guarded skepticism, because they have lived through too many false starts, too many moments when hope surged only to collapse. And while a name attached to evidence feels monumental, it also feels fragile, like something that could be taken away if one detail fails to hold. They are briefed carefully, investigators choosing language with precision, emphasizing what the DNA does and does not prove. And in those conversations, years of grief resurface, sharpened by the possibility that answers are finally within reach, and the emotional weight of that realization presses down hard. As the case advances, old evidence is re-examined through the lens of the suspect's movements. Timelines rebuilt with a clarity that wasn't possible before, and certain details snap into focus. A receipt that once seemed irrelevant, a witness statement dismissed as unreliable, a location overlooked because it didn't fit the original theory, and now the picture feels both clearer and more unsettling. Yet with every step forward, The gaps become more obvious, the missing hours that no one can account for, the witnesses who have died or moved away, the physical evidence that no longer exists, and the investigators are forced to confront an uncomfortable truth. Science can reopen doors, but it cannot rewind time. The suspect's defense grows more assertive. Public statements crafted carefully, emphasizing cooperation, highlighting the lack of direct evidence tying them to the disappearance itself. And in that space, doubt begins to creep back into the conversation, not among investigators, but among observers who understand how fragile cold cases can be. Behind closed doors, detectives argue constructively, challenging each other's assumptions, stress-testing the case as if they were the defense, because they know that a weak prosecution doesn't just fail, it risks closing the door forever, and the responsibility weighs heavy, not just to solve the case, but to solve it correctly. The community watches closely, drawn back into a story it thought belonged to the past. Neighbors recalling fragments, old rumors resurfacing, conversations reignited, and the collective memory shifts, reshaped by the idea that the answer may have been nearby all along, unnoticed, unchallenged. As weeks pass, the investigation slows again, not from lack of effort, but from the careful pace demanded by complexity. And in that lull, the word cold case takes on new meaning, no longer frozen, but unstable, thawed just enough to reveal its shape without giving up its secrets. The suspect remains free, constrained by legal boundaries, living under a microscope, every movement scrutinized, every choice interpreted, and that quiet standoff becomes its own kind of tension, a waiting game where everyone involved understands that the next development will either solidify the case or fracture it beyond repair. And somewhere between the promise of scientific certainty and the reality of human uncertainty, the investigation holds its breath. Because while the DNA has stunned investigators and reignited hope, it has also exposed how much of the truth still lies buried, not in evidence lockers, but in the spaces where time has erased clarity, leaving behind a story that refuses to settle into anything as simple as closure. Time stretches in a way it only does when a case refuses to move forward or backward, suspended between accusation and proof. And inside that tension, investigators begin doing the most dangerous thing in any long-running investigation. They start doubting not just the suspect, but the story itself, because once the DNA shock fades, what remains is a landscape full of holes, gaps that no technology can fill on its own. They reconstruct the last known day again, hour by hour, minute by minute, tracing movements through receipts, traffic patterns, witness recollections that have aged poorly. And what becomes clear is how thin certainty really is, because timelines built decades later are never solid. They're scaffolding held together by assumptions, and assumptions crack under pressure. The suspect's alibi from 1999 resurfaces, once accepted without resistance, now dragged into the light and examined from every angle. And it turns out to be less firm than anyone remembered, supported by people who no longer recall details clearly, by routines that feel familiar but resist precise placement in time. And suddenly the question isn't whether the alibi is false, but whether it was ever real in the first place. Investigators revisit witnesses who once shrugged and said they didn't see anything unusual, and now, confronted with the gravity of a DNA match, those same people hesitate, second-guess themselves, add qualifiers to old statements, and memory shifts in subtle, dangerous ways, because the mind wants to help, wants to make sense of chaos, even if that means rewriting the past. A former coworker recalls a conversation that might have happened, a comment that now feels ominous, but can't be dated with confidence. A neighbor remembers a car that looked out of place, but can't swear it was that night. Each detail feels like progress, yet none of it locks into place, and investigators feel the familiar frustration of chasing shadows that look convincing until you get close. The suspect's behavior under scrutiny becomes a story of its own. Friends describe someone calm, controlled, cooperative. Critics describe someone rehearsed, guarded, too precise. Both interpretations coexist, and neither can be proven, because demeanor is not evidence, and the law demands more than intuition, no matter how sharp that intuition feels. As pressure builds, the suspect's legal team pushes back harder, requesting full documentation of evidence handling from the late 90s, pointing out inconsistencies in chain of custody records that were once routine but now look sloppy by modern standards. And those challenges land with force because the past was not built for the scrutiny of the future. The DNA sample, once the star of the investigation, becomes a battleground. Experts argue over transfer possibilities, secondary contact, environmental degradation. Could it have arrived there indirectly? Could it have persisted from an innocent interaction? The questions multiply, not because the evidence is weak, but because it exists in isolation, detached from a clear narrative of how the crime actually unfolded. Behind closed doors, prosecutors hesitate. A case built primarily on DNA, without a body, without a crime scene that speaks clearly, without witnesses who can place the suspect in the act, is a gamble. And cold cases are unforgiving because a failed prosecution doesn't just lose a trial, it cements doubt permanently. The family senses the shift before anyone explains it. The calls for investigators become less frequent, more cautious. Language grows conditional again. Words like when quietly turn back into if, and the emotional whiplash is brutal because hope raised after so many years doesn't fade gently, it collapses. Public opinion fractures. Some cling to the headline, convinced science has spoken. Others point to the gaps, the decades of silence, the lack of definitive answers. Online forums light up with theories, accusations, counter-accusations, and the case takes on a second life, one fueled by speculation rather than evidence, where certainty is loud and complexity is ignored. Investigators retreat inward, focusing on what can still be controlled. They look not just at who might have done it, but at how it could have been done, studying patterns from similar cases in the era, disappearances that relied on familiarity, on trust, on moments when resistance was unlikely, and the unsettling realization emerges that the crime may have been simple, brutally simple, which is why it left so little behind. They search for a secondary location, a place that made sense in 1999 but has since been erased by development, a construction site, a vacant lot, a stretch of land that no longer exists as it did, and every map comparison feels like an accusation against time itself because progress has paved over potential answers. The suspect is interviewed again, more carefully this time, less confrontational, and the tone is almost conversational, designed to encourage narrative rather than defense. And for moments it seems to work, small inconsistencies surfacing, statements that don't quite align with earlier versions. But each time investigators push, the story stabilizes, retreating into ambiguity. No confession comes. No dramatic breakdown. Just controlled denial and carefully framed uncertainty. And that steadiness becomes its own problem, because it denies investigators the emotional leverage that sometimes cracks long-held silence. Meanwhile, evidence lockers yield nothing new. Items once preserved with hope now feel like relics from another era, labeled and sealed by people who never imagined they'd be reopened under this kind of scrutiny, and the weight of that history presses down on everyone involved. The case review committee meets, weighing options, debating strategy, confronting the possibility that despite the DNA, despite the renewed attention, the case may never move beyond suspicion, and that realization is not failure. But it feels like one, because it echoes the same ending the family has lived with for decades. The term cold case resurfaces in internal memos, no longer as a classification, but as a warning, a reminder that some cases resist resolution, not because no one cares, but because time dismantles truth piece by piece, leaving behind fragments that refuse to assemble cleanly. Outside, life goes on. New crimes capture headlines. New faces replace old ones. But in quiet moments, the case lingers unresolved, unstable, suspended between science and story, between proof and possibility. And investigators understand now that solving a cold case is not a single moment of revelation, but a prolonged confrontation with uncertainty. The DNA match stunned them, yes, but it did not deliver closure. And as the investigation slows once more, The questions shift from who did it to whether the full truth can ever be known at all, because some answers don't disappear, they erode, leaving behind a silence, so complete it feels intentional. And in that silence, the case breathes, neither alive nor dead, a reminder that even when science reaches back through time and pulls a name into the present, it cannot force the past to speak clearly. In California, still haunted by a disappearance that refuses to settle, learns again that some mysteries don't end, they endure, waiting, unresolved, for a certainty that may never come. The investigation doesn't collapse all at once. It thins, like fog lifting unevenly, revealing patches of clarity surrounded by persistent blind spots. And in those blind spots, investigators begin to feel the weight of what they cannot see, because every unanswered question now carries the echo of years lost, chances missed, moments when the truth might have surfaced and didn't. They turn back to the beginning again, not out of desperation, but necessity, re-listening to the earliest 911 calls, the ones recorded before fear hardened in a narrative, when voices still carried confusion instead of certainty. And those recordings sound different now, stripped of the assumptions layered onto them later, revealing hesitation, uncertainty, small details that were once dismissed because no one knew yet what mattered. One call mentions a sound, not a scream, not a crash, just something out of place in the quiet of the night. And at the time, it went nowhere, logged and forgotten, but now it's pulled forward, cross-referenced with weather reports, traffic data, anything that might contextualize it, and still it floats unattached, another fragment without an anchor. Detectives revisit the victim's routines with ruthless precision, mapping habits that once felt comforting, now suspicious in their predictability, because routines create opportunity, and opportunity doesn't require violence, just timing, familiarity, and someone willing to exploit both. And that realization shifts the tone of the investigation again, away from dramatic scenarios towards something colder, more calculated. They look closely at the social circles that surrounded her, not just close relationships, but acquaintances, peripheral figures who knew just enough to anticipate movements without drawing attention. And that widening lens complicates everything, because the list grows long and unmanageable, filled with people who left no trace strong enough to accuse, yet no absence strong enough to clear. The suspect remains central, unavoidable, a gravitational pull every theory bends toward. And yet the more investigators try to build outward from that point, the more resistance they meet, because no matter how many times they replay the timeline, no matter how many hypothetical paths they draw, the narrative refuses to crystallize into something solid. Behind the scenes, pressure mounts from above, quiet but persistent, the unspoken understanding that resources are finite, that attention has a shelf life, and that a case revived too long without movement risks becoming an embarrassment rather than a triumph, and that awareness sharpens every decision, making caution feel like hesitation and action feel like risk. The family senses the shift again, that subtle withdrawal of momentum, and their frustration surfaces not as anger, but exhaustion, because living with uncertainty is a form of labor that never ends, and each revival of the case demands emotional energy they don't know if they can afford anymore. They ask questions investigators struggle to answer honestly. What happens next? How long will this last? What is solved really mean if nothing changes? And in those moments, the limits of the system become painfully clear, because justice isn't just about finding answers, it's about proving them in a way that survives scrutiny, and proof is what time has eroded most effectively. The suspect's life continues under a strange duality, both ordinary and suspended, workdays punctuated by legal consultations, social interactions filtered through the awareness of being watched, and that tension becomes visible, not as panic, but as careful restraint, a person living cautiously in a world suddenly hostile, and observers read meaning into every gesture, every silence. Media interest spikes and dips unpredictably, driven by rumor, by anonymous sources, by speculation dressed as insight, and each wave of coverage reshapes public perception, turning uncertainty into assumption, assumption into belief, and belief into pressure that investigators must navigate without letting it dictate outcomes. In private, detectives debate alternative theories more openly now. Scenarios that don't center on the suspect, possibilities that once felt less compelling but now demand consideration. Because tunnel vision is the enemy of truth, and a cold case resurrected once can just as easily be buried again by stubborn focus. They explore the idea of a secondary actor, someone who intersected briefly, someone whose involvement left minimal trace. And that possibility is unsettling, because it suggests the DNA match might be only part of the story, a fragment of contact rather than the full explanation, and that realization threatens to unravel what little certainty exists. Evidence that once seemed definitive becomes conditional. Statements once taken at face value now feel fragile. Even the absence of a body, long a haunting feature of the case, takes on new meaning, not just as a gap, but as an obstacle that defines every legal calculation, because without it, the line between disappearance and homicide remains legally complex. Investigators consult specialists, psychologists, cold case experts who have seen this pattern before, cases where science reopened doors but couldn't force them fully open, and the advice is consistent, uncomfortable, and honest. Sometimes the truth is knowable without being provable, and the difference matters. That idea settles heavily, because it challenges the purpose of the entire effort, forcing everyone involved to confront a painful question. Is it better to pursue a case that may never reach court, or to accept uncertainty as the final state, knowing that the truth, whatever it is, will remain incomplete? The case file grows thicker with addendums, new interviews, new analyses, but progress is measured less in breakthroughs and more in refinements, narrowing what could have happened rather than confirming what did. And that slow grind wears on morale, because urgency fades when resolution feels distant. At night, some investigators admit the case follows them home, not as fear, but as unfinished business, the sense that something simple was missed long ago, something obvious that only hindsight reveals, and that haunting thought keeps them returning to the file long after obligation ends. The community, once galvanized, grows quieter again, attention drifting, memory softening, and that silence feels like a betrayal to some, a mercy to others, but to those closest to the case, it feels like abandonment, another layer of disappearance layered onto the first. As months pass, the language around the case shifts subtly but decisively. Solved disappears from internal conversations, replaced by active review and pending evaluation, phrases that signal movement without promising destination. And the emotional temperature cools, not because the mystery is resolved, but because expectations are being managed downward. The DNA match remains undeniable, immutable, but isolated, a single bright point in an otherwise dim field, and investigators understand now that without corroboration, without a narrative that connects that point to action, motive, and outcome, it may never carry the weight the public expects it to. And so the case settles into a new, uneasy phase, not cold, not active, something in between, a liminal space where truth is close enough to feel but too far to grasp. And in that space, everyone involved is forced to sit with the same uncomfortable reality. Some cases don't end with answers. They end with awareness of how much remains unknowable. The disappearance from 1999 continues to cast its shadow forward, reshaped by science, distorted by time, resistant to closure. And as investigators close their files at the end of another long day, they do so knowing that the mystery hasn't been defeated, only redefined, and that the silence surrounding it is not empty, but heavy with everything that was lost, overlooked, and left unresolved. The case exists now in a narrow corridor between certainty and collapse, and every step investigators take feels like walking on glass, because the closer they look, the more fragile the structure becomes, and yet turning away feels impossible, like abandoning something still breathing. They begin scrutinizing not just what happened, but how the investigation itself unfolded in 1999, questioning decisions that once seemed reasonable under pressure. And that retrospective examination is uncomfortable because it exposes how context shapes judgment, how limited tools and cultural assumptions narrowed the field long before anyone realized it. Back then, certain possibilities were dismissed almost automatically, scenarios that didn't fit prevailing narratives of crime, disappearances framed by expectations of violence rather than subtlety. And now, those blind spots loom large, casting doubt on what was never pursued with real conviction. Investigators find themselves asking a dangerous question. What if the case didn't go cold because it was too complex, but because it was too simple, because the truth didn't announce itself loudly enough to compete with more dramatic theories, and by the time simplicity was reconsidered, time had already erased its edges. They revisit overlooked reports, minor tips that never advanced beyond a note in a file, and among them are moments that feel uncomfortably close to relevance, brief sightings, casual comments, information that lacked urgency then, but now seems heavy with implication, and the realization hits hard that clarity often arrives only after it's too late to act on it. One tip describes a routine interaction that felt insignificant at the time, an encounter so ordinary it barely registered, but now, viewed through the lens of familiarity and opportunity, it takes on new weight, suggesting proximity without suspicion, and investigators sit with that implication, recognizing how easily danger can hide behind normalcy. They track down the source of the tip, now older, distant from the events, but still aware of them. And the interview is cautious, layered with uncertainty, memory fractured by years of retelling, and yet beneath that fragmentation is a consistent emotional response, a lingering sense that something was wrong, but never alarming enough to report with urgency. That gray area becomes the defining feature of the case, not evidence of innocence or guilt, but of ambiguity, the kind that thrives in real life and suffocates in courtrooms. Because ambiguity doesn't persuade, it confuses, and confusion benefits no one seeking closure. The suspect remains at the center of this ambiguity, neither collapsing under scrutiny nor rising above it. And that equilibrium frustrates investigators because it denies them momentum in either direction, no escalation, no resolution, just an ongoing standoff with uncertainty. They analyze communication records from the era, limited, incomplete, a snapshot of a time before constant digital tracking. And what they find is less helpful than they hoped, gaps where data should be, absences that could mean nothing or everything. And once again, the case is defined by what cannot be known. Experts are consulted again, this time not about DNA, but about behavior, about how people act when they believe they won't be caught, when they believe time will protect them. And those insights are unsettling because they suggest that confidence can look exactly like innocence, and patience can be indistinguishable from indifference. The family grows quieter, not because they've lost interest, but because they've learned the emotional cost of anticipation. And that restraint is heartbreaking in its own way, a defense mechanism built from years of disappointment. And investigators feel the weight of that silence more heavily than anger. They wonder privately whether pursuing the case further risks causing more harm than good, reopening wounds without delivering answers. And that ethical tension becomes harder to ignore because the purpose of justice is not just resolution, but responsibility. And sometimes restraint is the most responsible option. But restraint feels like surrender, and surrender feels like betrayal. And so the work continues slower, more deliberate, less visible, as if by lowering expectations, the truth might feel less pressure to hide. They examine similar cases from the same period, looking for patterns that might contextualize this disappearance. And what emerges is a sobering reminder that many cases from that era remain unresolved, victims swallowed by systems still learning how to see beyond obvious violence. And that shared silence feels both comforting and condemning. In those comparisons, investigators find no clear template, no matching scenario that explains everything, only variations on absence, on trust exploited, on moments when danger slipped through unnoticed, and the realization deepens that this case may never conform to a single explanation. The suspect's presence in the investigation becomes increasingly symbolic, representing not just a possible answer, but the limits of what can be proven, and that symbolic weight distorts perception, making every new piece of information feel either monumental or meaningless, depending on the lens applied. As months turn into another year, administrative pressure resurfaces, quiet but firm, reminding investigators that cases must move or make way for others, and that reality forces a reckoning, not about truth, but about feasibility, about what can realistically be achieved given what remains. They consider the possibility of an arrest without a guaranteed conviction, a move that would satisfy public demand but risk legal collapse, and the debate is intense because such a decision would define the case forever, either as a triumph or as a cautionary tale of overreach. Ultimately, caution prevails, not because of doubt in the DNA, but because of respect for what the law requires, and that choice, while rational, feels emotionally hollow, like stopping just short of finish line that may never have existed. The case is reviewed again, summarized not for the public, but for the future, a record of what was found, what was suspected, what could not be proven, and that document reads less like a conclusion and more like a confession of limits. Investigators acknowledge among themselves what they would never say publicly, that they may know more than they can ever prove, that the truth may be visible only to those who have lived inside the case long enough to feel its shape, and that such knowledge carries no legal power. The suspect remains, the DNA remains, the absence remains, and the case settles deeper into its unresolved state, not erased, not abandoned, but stabilized into a form that resists further change. For the community, the story fades again, returning to the background noise of unresolved mysteries, referenced occasionally, remembered selectively, and that fading feels like a second disappearance, quieter but just as final. And through it all, the original moment persists, that early morning interruption, that unanswered question, stretching across decades, reminding everyone involved that some crimes don't announce their endings, they dissolve into time, leaving behind not certainty, but a permanent echo, a reminder that even when a cold case is touched by science, it can still refuse to yield its final truth. The case drifts into a phase that feels less like investigation and more like vigilance, a constant low-level awareness that something unresolved is still breathing beneath the surface, and investigators adjust to that reality by watching rather than pushing, listening rather than demanding, because force has proven useless against a mystery this patient. They begin monitoring the suspect's life not as an active target, but as a variable that might change under pressure, because time has a way of loosening what fear keeps tight, and subtle shifts matter now more than dramatic moves, a relocation, a financial change, a relationship ending, anything that might trigger instability where certainty once lived. Nothing dramatic happens. Days pass cleanly. Weeks slide by. The suspect remains composed, almost unnervingly so, and that steadiness becomes its own form of noise because people under this kind of scrutiny often crack in small, visible ways. Yet here there's restraint, discipline, and absence of mistakes that feels intentional. Investigators wonder whether they're seeing strength or rehearsal, confidence or control, and the line between the two is invisible without corroboration, leaving them stuck again in the familiar fog of interpretation rather than fact. They turn their attention outward, away from individuals and toward environment, asking how California looked in 1999 when viewed not through nostalgia, but vulnerability, studying transit routes, industrial zones, places that once existed on the margins of awareness, spaces where movement went unnoticed because no one was looking for it. Old maps are layered over new ones. Developments appear where empty land once stretched. Roads curve differently now. Some locations are erased entirely, replaced by concrete and commerce. And that physical transformation feels personal, like the landscape itself has chosen to forget. One location draws renewed interest, a site that fit the timeline but never produced evidence. Overlooked because searches were limited, technology primitive, and manpower stretched thin, and investigators visited again, knowing that expectations must remain low, but driven by the obligation to look where they once couldn't. The site offers nothing tangible, no remains, no objects, no definitive trace, just silence and the sense that if something was ever there, it is gone now, taken by weather, construction, or intention, and that absence reinforces the reality that some opportunities don't repeat. Back at the office, discussion turns philosophical in a way law enforcement rarely admits publicly. Conversations about probability rather than certainty, about how truth behaves when exposed to time. And those discussions are uncomfortable because they highlight a gap between what feels known and what can be demonstrated. The phrase "we believe" enters the language more often than "we know." And that distinction matters because belief doesn't convict, belief doesn't close cases, belief only sustains effort, and even that has limits. The family is updated again, gently, carefully, with honesty stripped of optimism, and their reaction is not surprise but resignation, a quiet acknowledgement that they have been here before, that momentum always seems to crest and recede without delivering answers. They ask a question no one wants to answer. If not now, then when? And the silence that follows is heavy, because it acknowledges the possibility that when may never arrive. Media interest wanes once more. Without arrests or revelations, the story loses traction, replaced by newer, louder tragedies, and the case slips back into that strange category of known but unfinished, where familiarity dulls urgency and mystery becomes background noise. Internally, investigators document everything meticulously, knowing that the future may belong to someone else, another set of eyes, another generation with tools and perspectives they can't imagine. And that thought offers a thin thread of comfort, the idea that the story isn't over, just paused. They secure evidence again, reseal boxes, update databases, and the ritual feels final even when it isn't meant to be. Because closing a drawer on a case like this is never neutral. It carries the weight of surrender disguised as procedure. The suspect fades from daily focus, not cleared, not charged, existing in that ambiguous space where suspicion lingers without consequence, and that unresolved status becomes its own sentence, neither punishment nor freedom, just perpetual proximity to a question that never goes away. In private moments, investigators admit what they cannot say aloud, that the case has taught them more about limits than answers, about how certainty is a luxury built on timing, and how justice depends as much on when something is discovered as on what is discovered. They reflect on the DNA again, that spark that reignited everything, and now feels almost cruel in its precision, because it offered clarity without completion, connection without narrative, and that partial truth has reshaped the case without resolving it. The community, largely unaware of these internal shifts, continues on, the disappearance now a historical footnote for most, and that collective forgetting stings more than hostility ever did, because it suggests that time has done what no suspect could. It has diluted the urgency of loss. Yet for those closest to the case, forgetting is impossible. Every anniversary, every familiar street, every headline about solved cold cases elsewhere feels like a reminder of what didn't happen here, and that comparison becomes its own quiet torment. As the investigation slows to a crawl, a final review is conducted, not as an ending, but as a checkpoint, an acknowledgement of where things stand and why they cannot move forward without something new, something unexpected, something that hasn't yet surfaced. The conclusion is restrained, professional, unsatisfying. The case remains open, active in status, unresolved in reality, supported by evidence that suggests contact but not conclusion, proximity but not proof. And in that unresolved state, the case continues to exist, not loudly, not urgently, but persistently, like a low-frequency hum beneath everyday life, reminding everyone involved that some mysteries don't demand attention. They endure without it. California moves on. Seasons change, streets fill and empty, and somewhere within that motion, the unanswered question from 1999 remains exactly where it has always been, waiting not for time, but for truth, knowing that time alone has never been enough to make it speak. What follows is not momentum, but endurance, the long, quiet stretch where a case survives on memory rather than movement, and investigators learn to live with the discomfort of unfinished work, because closing a file is easier than carrying it, and this one refuses to be set down. Years pass in increments marked not by breakthroughs, but by administrative updates, routine audits, briefings that sound the same each time, and within those repetitions the case begins to feel less like an investigation and more like a presence, something that occupies space without announcing itself. New detectives rotate in, younger, trained in a world shaped by technology and data, and when they first encounter the file, they feel the familiar surge of confidence that comes with fresh perspective, the belief that distance from the original failures will bring clarity, and they approach the case with energy, convinced that something obvious has been missed. They read everything. They map everything. They question everything. And slowly, inevitably, their confidence softens into caution because they realize what their predecessors already learned, that this case doesn't hide behind complexity. It hides behind absence, behind the things that never happened, the evidence never collected, the questions never asked at the right time. One of them focuses on the DNA again, not to dispute it, but to contextualize it, asking how often such matches exist without leading to convictions. And the answer is unsettling because the number is higher than expected. Cases where science identifies contact but cannot narrate crime. And that distinction matters more than the public understands. Another detective revisits the suspect's timeline with obsessive precision, trying to compress uncertainty into something actionable. But every attempt ends the same way, with overlapping possibilities rather than a single path, and the realization settles, and that probability alone is not enough. They consult with statisticians, with behavioral analysts, with legal experts, all offering insight, none offering resolution, and the case becomes a study in limits, a demonstration of where modern investigation still falls short, even with tools that once seemed miraculous. The family is informed of the renewed review, and their reaction is restrained, cautious, hopeful only in theory, because they have learned not to attach emotion to effort anymore. And that detachment is heartbreaking, a survival mechanism shaped by years of raised and shattered expectations. They ask fewer questions now. They listen more than they speak. And when they thank investigators for continuing, the gratitude feels heavy, undeserved, because everyone involved knows that persistence is not the same as progress. The suspect, aging like everyone else, fades further into the background of public consciousness, no longer the subject of headlines, just a name in a file, and that invisibility is its own kind of resolution, not justice, not exoneration, but disappearance without explanation, mirroring the original crime in a way that feels bitterly ironic. Occasionally, something stirs, a tip from someone who watched a documentary, a message from an amateur researcher convinced they've cracked the code, and investigators follow up every time. Because even unlikely leads deserve respect, but each one dissolves under scrutiny, leaving behind the familiar residue of disappointment. The case develops a reputation within the department, not as unsolvable, but as resistant, the kind of file that humbles those who touch it, and that reputation shapes how it's approached, with care, with patience, with an understanding that certainty may never be achievable. In training sessions, it's referenced obliquely, a reminder that not all cases end cleanly, that some demand acceptance rather than closure, and young officers listen with the confidence of those who haven't yet learned how deeply unresolved work can follow you. Outside the department, the community's relationship with the case continues to erode, memory thinning, details blurring, until the disappearance becomes an anecdote rather than a wound. And that transition feels like loss layered on top of loss, because forgetting is the one thing no investigation can prevent. Every so often, an anniversary prompts a brief resurgence of attention, a short article, a segment on local news, the familiar photograph displayed again. And for a moment, the past intrudes on the present, forcing a reckoning with how much time has passed without answers. Those moments are hardest for the family, because they reopen everything without offering anything new, and yet they cling to them, because silence feels worse than disappointment, and visibility, however brief, still feels like acknowledgement. Internally, the case remains open, technically active, but everyone understands what that means in practice. That unless something external changes, unless someone speaks, Unless new evidence emerges from an unexpected place, the file will remain exactly as it is. Investigators talk quietly about legacy, about what it means to leave cases behind, and this one stands out not because of its notoriety, but because of its persistence, the way it refuses to resolve despite attention, despite effort, despite time. One detective admits that the case has changed how they see certainty itself, that they no longer believe in clean answers the way they once did, and that admission is shared more widely than expected, because it resonates with everyone who has lived inside the file. The DNA, still there, still incontrovertible, begins to feel less like a solution and more like a question mark, a symbol of how close and yet how far the truth can be, and that duality becomes the defining characteristic of the case. It is no longer about solving a crime, but about understanding the shape of uncertainty, about recognizing that some truths exist without resolution, and that acknowledgement feels both honest and deeply unsatisfying. As another year closes, the case is reviewed once more, not for strategy, but for preservation, ensuring that nothing is lost, that whatever remains can be carried forward intact. And that act, though procedural, feels deeply human, an expression of refusal to forget. Because forgetting would be easier. Forgetting would be quieter. Forgetting would allow the unanswered question to dissolve into history. But the case persists, carried by those who refuse to let absence become normal, who understand that even without resolution, bearing witness matters. And so the story continues, not as a pursuit of certainty, but as an act of remembrance. The disappearance from 1999 remains unresolved, suspended between what is known and what can never be proven. And in that suspension, it teaches a final, uncomfortable lesson. That justice is not always an outcome. Sometimes it is simply the decision to keep looking, even when the path forward has all but disappeared. The case doesn't announce its survival. It simply refuses to die, lingering in quiet corners of the department where old files are kept not out of optimism, but respect. And over time, that quiet endurance begins to shape the people who carry it, teaching them how unresolved stories age, how they change without ever concluding. A new technological promise emerges, not loudly, not with headlines, but in internal briefings and research papers, advancements in forensic genealogy, probabilistic modeling, methods that didn't exist when the DNA first stunned investigators. And the idea takes hold slowly, cautiously, because hope has become something everyone handles with gloves. The DNA sample is reviewed again, not to confirm the match, but to explore what else it might reveal, relationships rather than identity, networks instead of names, and that shift in approach feels significant because it reframes the evidence as context rather than conclusion. Specialists explain the limitations clearly. This won't solve the case on its own. It won't rewrite history, but it might expose connections that were invisible before, familial links, geographic patterns, subtle alignments that could suggest how the suspect fit into a larger picture, and investigators listen with a mixture of interest and restraint. Permission is requested. Protocols are followed. The process moves slowly, burdened by ethical review and legal caution, because every new technique carries consequences beyond the case itself, and nothing about this investigation has ever been simple. As the analysis unfolds, fragments of information surface, not dramatic, not definitive, but suggestive, pointing toward a network of associations that once intersected casually, socially, professionally, and the realization forms that the suspect may not have been as isolated as previously assumed. Those associations are examined carefully, names long forgotten resurfacing briefly, then fading again when timelines don't align or connections prove too weak, and once more, investigators confront the pattern that defines the case: proximity without proof. One connection stands out longer than the others, not because it confirms anything, but because it raises a question that had never been asked in the original investigation. And that question shifts focus subtly, but meaningfully, redirecting attention toward an interaction that once seemed irrelevant. They track it down as far as they can, but the trail is thin, degraded by time and memory. And while it doesn't deliver answers, it reinforces an unsettling theme. that the truth may not lie in a single act, but in a sequence of small, forgettable moments that collectively led to disappearance. The family is informed again, gently, and their response is quiet, attentive, cautiously receptive, because they understand now that progress in this case doesn't look like resolution. It looks like refinement, a gradual narrowing of what might have happened rather than a declaration of what did. They ask whether this changes anything. Investigators answer honestly. It changes perspective. It does not change outcome. And that distinction lands heavily because perspective offers understanding, but not justice. The suspect's name surfaces again briefly in internal discussions, not as a focus of accusation, but as a reference point, a constant against which all new information is measured. And that role, while less visible, is no less significant because it anchors the case even as everything else shifts. Years have softened the edges of outrage, but not the shape of loss. And within the department, the case becomes a marker, a reference for how time interacts with evidence, how science can illuminate without resolving, and how persistence sometimes exists for its own sake. Investigators begin to speak about the case differently, not in terms of solving, but documenting, ensuring that whatever is known is preserved clearly, coherently, without distortion for whoever may come next. And that archival mindset signals a quiet acceptance of uncertainty. Outside, the world continues to change rapidly, technology accelerating, attention spans shrinking, and unresolved cases like this one struggle to compete for relevance. Yet they remain anchored by the fact that they involve real lives, real absences, real consequences that don't fade with news cycles. Occasionally, a new officer asks the question everyone thinks but rarely voices: what if this is as far as it goes? And the answer, when it comes, is neither optimistic nor cynical, just honest. Then this is where it rests until something changes. The case teaches patience in a way no training ever could. The patience to sit with incomplete narratives, to resist the urge to force coherence where none exists. And that lesson, while invaluable, comes at a cost because it demands acceptance of limits. The DNA remains a constant, a reminder of how close the truth feels, how tangible, and yet how unreachable. And that paradox defines the emotional core of the investigation, a tension that never resolves, only shifts. As another review cycle concludes, the file is returned to its place, not forgotten, not dismissed, but acknowledged for what it is: a story interrupted, a question left open, a silence that continues to speak. And in that silence, the case endures, not waiting for time to fix it, but for something entirely different: a voice, a memory, a fragment that hasn't yet surfaced, knowing that until then, the disappearance from 1999 will remain what it has always been: not just a cold case, but a reminder that some truths exist just beyond reach, close enough to haunt, distant enough to survive. The years layer themselves over the case like sediment, quiet accumulation of moments, reports, theories, dead ends, each one pressing down, making the weight heavier, and investigators learn to carry it with a kind of disciplined detachment, because the alternative is being consumed by what cannot be solved. Every new development feels magnified against the backdrop of history. A phone call, a minor tip, a routine audit of evidence. Anything that signals movement ignites both hope and dread, because momentum in this case has always carried the double edge of potential breakthrough and inevitable disappointment. The department tracks these moments carefully, internally, documenting every reaction, every decision, but the public sees only the absence of resolution, and that perception shapes everything that follows. The suspect remains central, a shadow at the edge of every theory, yet elusive, a reminder of the way certainty can evade even the most meticulous investigation. Investigators pore over the timelines again, cross-referencing details that once seemed trivial. Every purchase, every appointment, every casual interaction, because small patterns sometimes reveal what large ones cannot. And yet, the more they analyze, the more the gaps assert themselves. Moments where the trail goes cold, memories vanish, and evidence that might have pointed the way is now irretrievably lost. DNA that once felt like the spark of clarity now carries the weight of ambiguity. It confirms presence, but not intent, contact, but not culpability, proximity, but not narrative. Each lab report is scrutinized, reinterpreted, debated, and each time, investigators are reminded of the gap between what science can tell them and what the law requires to act. The legal threshold becomes a mirror reflecting the insufficiency of knowledge. Proof demands connection, and connection remains frustratingly incomplete. The family's patience has worn thin over time, replaced by a careful, muted vigilance. Their interactions with investigators are marked by a quiet, almost imperceptible tension, a mix of hope for news and resignation to silence. They ask questions with measured caution, careful not to betray the depth of their anxiety. But the weight behind each question is palpable. How close are you? What do you really know? Will this ever end? And in the pauses between answers, the enormity of absence is felt, a reminder that no procedural update can erase the lived reality of missing someone who has never returned. Investigators themselves struggle with a shifting internal landscape. New technologies and methods emerge constantly, promising to illuminate the dark corners of unresolved cases, but they also demand critical scrutiny, ethical deliberation, and resources that are never infinite. Every potential breakthrough is weighed against practical feasibility, and the lessons of past missteps temper enthusiasm, reminding them that progress is often incremental and provisional, not definitive. The community, meanwhile, has moved forward, life continuing around the absence, forgetting in part as a coping mechanism. But anniversaries and occasional mentions in media reawaken collective memory, triggering faint shockwaves in a society that otherwise prefers resolution or closure. Local newspapers reference the disappearance briefly, usually in a roundup of unsolved crimes. And though the articles are short, their impact is lasting, rekindling public attention and inviting speculation, which in turn filters back to the investigators who continue to monitor both facts and perception. Within the department, discussion grows more strategic. Cold cases like this are now not just about solving the individual disappearance, but about understanding systemic patterns. What factors delayed resolution? How did technological limitations and procedural gaps shape the outcome? How does one distinguish between stagnation caused by insufficient evidence versus the natural opacity of human behavior? These questions do not produce immediate answers, but they sharpen understanding, and in a quiet, almost imperceptible way, the knowledge becomes a tool, even if it cannot directly resolve the original crime. Investigators revisit old interviews repeatedly. Statements once considered peripheral now acquire a gravity born of hindsight. A neighbor's vague recollection of an unfamiliar vehicle, a clerk's memory of a late-night transaction, a friend's report of an unremarkable encounter. Each moment is re-examined for meaning, for alignment, for patterns invisible at the time. The process is painstaking, repetitive, and deeply human, because understanding is as much about patience and interpretation as it is about evidence. Suspicion shifts subtly but persistently. The focus oscillates between the known suspect and peripheral figures, reflecting a growing awareness that human behavior is rarely simple. Opportunity, motive, and chance intersect in ways that can obscure culpability, and investigators must reconcile the clarity of evidence with the murkiness of context. They confront the uncomfortable realization that even with a DNA match, narrative closure is not guaranteed. Forensic certainty does not translate automatically into legal or emotional resolution. Time itself becomes a character in the narrative, not merely a measure of elapsed years, but an active force shaping memory, evidence, and perception. Witnesses forget, documents degrade, landscapes change. What was once obvious can vanish entirely, leaving only shadows and impressions, forcing investigators to interpret absence as actively as presence. They grapple with the knowledge that some moments can never be recovered, The human perception is both fragile and selective, and that even the most thorough investigation cannot resurrect what time has claimed. Yet the work continues. Daily routines persist, lab analyses are revisited, digital records scrutinized anew, each iteration refining understanding even if it cannot produce a final answer. The file itself grows thicker, annotations layering atop annotations, a living document of persistence, caution, and restraint, and in that accumulation of effort lies a subtle, unspoken acknowledgement. The value of investigation exists even when closure does not. And through all of this, the disappearance remains central, a silent force around which lives rotate, shaping not only investigation, but also expectation, memory, and the sense of justice. The 1999 case refuses to resolve into narrative simplicity. It endures, persistent as a shadow, a low hum of unanswered questions, a presence both haunting and instructive, a reminder that some truths exist not as conclusions, but as enduring mysteries that define those who engage with them. Even as investigators leave the office at night, walk the streets of California under streetlights that illuminate more than they reveal, the case lingers, a quiet companion that refracts every thought, every decision, every calculation. It exists in the gaps, the absences, the moments never recorded, never noticed, never acted upon, and in that lingering presence, it maintains its ultimate hold, a cold case in name, in history, in memory, but in reality, alive, unresolved, and inescapable. The investigation has settled into a rhythm defined more by patience than urgency, a pattern of careful observation punctuated by moments of fleeting excitement when a new lead or piece of information emerges. Every report, every lab note, every tip is cataloged meticulously, and yet the paradox persists. The more information is gathered, the more the void of certainty seems to expand. Investigators find themselves navigating the narrow line between diligence and obsession, aware that the pursuit of answers can consume the very lives dedicated to finding them. The suspect remains central, a constant reference point, yet increasingly distant in reality. Daily life has overtaken the simplicity of the initial timeline. Years of social evolution, personal change, and geographic shifts have rendered the suspect a figure partly frozen in memory, partly fluid in speculation. Investigators track patterns, analyze social ties, and examine minor inconsistencies. But each revelation brings only new questions, highlighting the difficulty of reconstructing events that were never fully recorded. Advances in forensic genealogy offer a glimmer of possibility. The DNA that once promised closure now serves as a portal into networks, relationships, and patterns that might hint at opportunity or motive. Specialists comb databases, seeking links between relatives, connections in social or professional spheres, and subtle overlaps that could expose previously invisible intersections. Every potential lead, however tenuous, is scrutinized with care because even minor insights can shift understanding in cases defined by absence rather than action. Investigators convene repeatedly to review these new findings. Maps are overlaid with timelines, clusters of interactions are cross-referenced, and seemingly insignificant events are analyzed with painstaking precision. A neighbor's recollection of a vehicle, a clerk's memory of a late-night purchase, a friend's recollection of an unusual encounter, all are weighed, aligned, and dissected. But for each thread, there are contradictions, gaps, and uncertainties that prevent a coherent narrative from emerging. The process is exhausting, both mentally and emotionally, because it requires constant attention to detail, meticulous reasoning, and a tolerance of ambiguity. The family remains a quiet, persistent presence. They do not demand answers with the intensity of early years. Their patience has been tempered by disappointment. But they are attentive, listening to updates, asking pointed questions when they feel compelled, and reminding investigators of the human stakes behind the procedural rigor. Their questions are rarely accusatory. They are measured, informed by years of understanding the limitations of investigation. And in every conversation, the emotional gravity is palpable. The absence of resolution is itself a source of ongoing suffering. Public interest waxes and wanes. Media coverage is fleeting, appearing briefly on anniversaries or in retrospectives about unsolved crimes, then disappearing as other stories dominate headlines. The case exists now mostly in internal memory, in departmental archives, and in the subtle influence it exerts on approaches to similar investigations. But when coverage surfaces, even briefly, it creates ripples. Local recollections resurface, new witnesses are motivated to speak, and even small details can rekindle momentum, though rarely enough to solve the mystery outright. Every new investigator who encounters the case is struck by the persistence of its unresolved nature. Unlike other cold cases, where leads eventually dry up or suspects are identified definitively, this one resists narrative closure. The blend of confirmed DNA evidence, witness uncertainty, and the elusiveness of the suspect creates a tension that is simultaneously precise and intangible, leaving every participant aware of the limits of perception, reasoning, and evidence. Time, more than any human actor, asserts itself as the dominant factor. Witnesses' memories fade, locations change, and physical evidence deteriorates despite careful preservation. Streets where the disappearance might have occurred are remodeled, structures demolished, and traces erased. Investigators confront the reality that some answers may now exist only in the realm of probability, pattern recognition, and inference, and that legal closure may be forever out of reach. Internal debates persist. Should investigators pursue leads that are weak but technically possible? Should resources be allocated to the ongoing review or redirected to cases with more tangible prospects? Each decision carries weight, as every day spent on this cold case is a day not spent elsewhere, yet abandoning it entirely feels morally impossible. The file, with its growing weight of notes, reports, and observations, becomes a repository not just of evidence, but of responsibility, of ethical obligation, and of the persistence of unanswered questions. The emotional texture of the case is as complex as the forensic detail. Frustration, resignation, hope, doubt, and determination coexist, overlapping and intertwining. Investigators develop an intimate familiarity with ambiguity, learning to interpret small inconsistencies as potentially significant and to read silence with the same intensity as recorded statements. They come to understand that, in some instances, absence itself carries meaning, a silent testimony to what transpired or what was deliberately concealed. Despite technological advances, despite the persistence of professional dedication, the disappearance from 1999 remains unresolved. Every attempt to reconstruct the sequence of events encounters gaps too wide to bridge definitively. Each DNA match suggests contact. Each minor tip implies opportunity. But together they do not coalesce into proof sufficient to close the case. The tension between what is known and what can be demonstrated continues to define the investigation, shaping both strategy and expectation. In quiet moments, investigators reflect on the lessons the case imparts. It has taught patience, precision, and humility. It has demonstrated the limits of forensic science, human memory, and procedural authority. It has also reinforced the human cost of unresolved absence, the enduring grief of family, the persistent curiosity of community, and the psychological weight carried by those charged with pursuing truth. Ultimately, the case exists in a suspended state, not inactive, not forgotten, but alive in memory, in procedure, in careful monitoring, and in the ethical commitment to bear witness to what cannot yet be proven. It persists as a low-frequency presence, shaping decision-making, defining professional boundaries, and serving as a perpetual reminder that some mysteries resist resolution, that some cold cases are defined not by the moment they began, but by the decades they endure. And so, the 1999 California disappearance continues to exist as it always has, a story of absence and evidence, of presence without certainty, of time without resolution. The DNA match that once stunned investigators remains a symbol of both potential and limitation. The suspect remains a figure of intrigue, yet never fully reachable. The family continues to live with the ambiguity that the world has largely forgotten. And in this tension, the case sustains its presence, teaching those who engage with it that closure is not always possible, and that sometimes the act of investigation itself becomes the measure of justice. Even as decades pass, the 1999 California cold case retains a grip that is difficult to quantify, a shadow over every attempt to move forward, a quiet insistence that nothing is ever truly complete. Investigators have come and gone, technologies have evolved, and yet the case remains active, a persistent presence in departmental records. And in the minds of those who have carried it through time, their experience shaped as much by what they cannot know as by what they can confirm. The DNA match that once electrified the investigation is still analyzed periodically, revisited as new techniques in forensic science emerge. Analysts look for familial links, potential accomplices, even distant relationships that might shed light on the suspect's movements and connections in 1999. Each new insight offers the possibility of understanding, but never the certainty of resolution. The presence of partial evidence is both tantalizing and cruel, confirming involvement without constructing a narrative, revealing proximity without establishing motive, offering fragments without the whole. The suspect's life is studied indirectly through public records, social networks, and historical transactions. Investigators seek patterns, subtle shifts in behavior, anything that might illuminate opportunities or tendencies. But the passage of time has blurred many of the traces, leaving gaps that no retrospective analysis can fully fill. People have moved, jobs have changed, memories have faded. The original environment where the crime occurred has been altered. Streets have been rerouted, buildings demolished, landscapes transformed, and the physical context that once framed the disappearance is now partially lost to history. Family members, meanwhile, continue to navigate the quiet agony of unresolved grief. Each anniversary, each brief mention in media, revives the memory of absence, and each contact with law enforcement reinforces the duality of hope and despair. They ask fewer questions now, but each one carries immense emotional weight. Where do we stand now? Is there anything new? Will we ever know what happened? Investigators respond with careful honesty, acknowledging new findings while reinforcing that nothing has yet yielded definitive closure. The tension between information and resolution is palpable, shaping the emotional landscape for everyone involved. Internally, the department has come to view the case as emblematic of the limitations of human investigation. It is a lesson in patience, in the ethical responsibility of persistence, in the recognition that some questions may never receive answers. Training new detectives often includes reference to this case, emphasizing that not all cold cases conclude with arrest or confession, and that understanding the boundaries of evidence is as important as collecting it. The file becomes both tool and cautionary tale, a repository of knowledge and a monument to uncertainty. Public memory of the case continues to fade. Local media references occur only sporadically, typically in retrospectives or in reports on other cold cases solved elsewhere. Yet even these brief mentions can generate small waves. Previously silent witnesses come forward, new details are recalled, and investigators are prompted to reassess the web of relationships, locations, and interactions surrounding the disappearance. Each tiny resurgence demonstrates that even when the world forgets, the case itself endures, a persistent presence resisting complete erasure. The human component of investigation is tested repeatedly. Officers confront the emotional weight of decades-long pursuit, balancing professional detachment with empathy for the family, recognizing the psychological toll of prolonged uncertainty. Each new lead, however weak, is evaluated with care, each decision weighed against potential consequences, not only for the investigation, but for those whose lives have been shaped by unresolved absence. The case is as much about the ongoing process of bearing witness as it is about uncovering truth. Technology continues to evolve, offering new tools for analysis. Forensic genealogy, data modeling, digital reconstruction. Each innovation is explored cautiously, with acknowledgement of ethical considerations, privacy concerns, and legal boundaries. The DNA evidence, while central, is contextualized against a broader array of information, creating a multidimensional approach that prioritizes connections and patterns over assumptions. Investigators are reminded that insight does not always equate to resolution, and that even the most sophisticated tools cannot substitute for the human complexity that underlies every disappearance. Despite the passage of years, the suspect remains elusive, existing simultaneously in concrete records and in the intangible space of speculation. Investigators understand that proximity does not equate to culpability, that opportunity does not confirm intent, and that time can obscure as much as it reveals. The absence of mistakes, the persistence of pattern, and the careful maintenance of anonymity create a tension that reinforces the enduring challenge of the case, knowing too much to dismiss, but never enough to conclude. In the quiet hours, investigators reflect on the broader implications of the case. It has taught lessons about perseverance, humility, and the limits of evidence. It has underscored the importance of methodical documentation, ethical practice, and the recognition that some questions may remain forever unanswered. And, perhaps most profoundly, it has highlighted the human cost of unresolved loss, the enduring pain of families, the frustration of law enforcement, and the lingering presence of absence that shapes memory and narrative alike. The case persists as a cold case in name, a continuing investigation in practice, a story that refuses to resolve completely. It exists in departmental records, in DNA databases, in the careful notes of investigators, in the collective memory of those affected, and in the quiet spaces of human consciousness where questions remain unanswered. It endures both as a challenge and as a lesson, a reminder that some truths are defined not by closure, but by the relentless pursuit of understanding. California moves forward around it, unaware of the intricacies, the painstaking work, the emotional weight carried silently. Streets change, communities evolve, new generations grow up in a landscape subtly marked by absence. Yet within the constancy of change, the disappearance from 1999 endures, its presence felt in every careful review, every analytical session, every interaction with the family. The case is neither resolved nor forgotten. It exists in the liminal space between what is known and what may never be known, a persistent testament to the endurance of mystery and to the commitment of those who refuse to let it fade into oblivion. Even as the new century advances, the 1999 California cold case remains an active ghost in the halls of the department, a file that refuses to gather dust because those who have carried it understand the weight of absence, the moral obligation to preserve memory, and the subtle power of unresolved questions. Each revisit to the evidence, each reanalysis of witness statements, is a quiet act of persistence, a refusal to allow the story to dissolve completely into time. Investigators, now seasoned by decades of experience, approach the case with a tempered intensity, aware that patience and methodical review are often more potent than sudden breakthroughs. DNA continues to occupy the center of the investigation, its revelation once revolutionary, now contextualized within a framework of advanced forensic analysis. Laboratories revisit the original sample, applying new techniques that were inconceivable in 1999, advanced sequencing, familial searching, probabilistic matching. Every iteration produces insight, but rarely confirmation. The data illuminating relationships without constructing narrative, suggesting presence without exposing intent. Analysts tread carefully, aware that even the smallest misinterpretation could mislead and that evidence alone cannot narrate a crime. It can only point toward possibility. Investigators pore over timelines with painstaking detail. They map the movements of the suspect and potential witnesses, comparing them against social, occupational, and familial patterns. Every casual encounter, every small anomaly in behavior is re-examined. A forgotten conversation in a cafe, a fleeting observation from a passerby, a transaction once considered trivial. These fragments are stitched into a web of probability. Yet the web resists cohesion, highlighting the fundamental challenge of reconstructing an event that no one saw fully and no evidence has yet resolved. The family, now decades older, inhabits a quiet tension between acceptance and hope. They ask few questions, but listen intently to every update, understanding that progress may come in incremental refinements rather than sudden revelations. Their presence is both grounding and heavy, reminding investigators that the pursuit of truth is never abstract. It touches real lives, shapes experiences, and sustains long-term consequences. Every interaction reinforces the central tension of the investigation, the coexistence of progress and incompleteness, the weight of knowing without closure. Internal review meetings have evolved into exercises not just in strategy, but in reflection. Investigators analyze procedural decisions, identify missed opportunities, and debate interpretations, all while recognizing the limitations imposed by time, memory, and the constraints of law. The file, dense with annotations and evidence logs, serves as both roadmap and warning, demonstrating that meticulous record-keeping is essential for endurance, if not immediate resolution. Every review is conducted with humility, the acknowledgement that certainty is rarely absolute, and that even decades of effort can leave questions unanswered. Public awareness of the case waxes and wanes. Media mentions surface occasionally, documentaries, retrospectives, or brief features on cold cases, but these moments, while fleeting, generate waves of attention. New tips emerge, sometimes from neighbors, sometimes from individuals motivated by curiosity or guilt, occasionally from amateur sleuths tracking patterns online. Investigators vet these leads carefully. Most dissolve under scrutiny, but a few survive long enough to shift focus subtly, to reorient lines of inquiry, or to illuminate previously unnoticed connections. Over time, the case shapes the department's understanding of unresolved crime. It becomes a benchmark for evaluating investigative techniques, technological adoption, and procedural evolution. Younger detectives studying it learn that investigation is as much about endurance as insight, that some questions may never be answered fully, and that ethical responsibility includes both action and restraint. The case teaches them to interpret absence as carefully as presence, to read gaps and inconsistencies with precision, and to respect the complex interplay between evidence, human behavior, and legal standards. The suspect remains a central, elusive figure. Though their movements can be partially reconstructed, the human narrative is incomplete. Analysts consider patterns of behavior, relationships, and opportunity, yet the gaps frustrate attempts to construct definitive timelines or motives. The passage of time has rendered some aspects irretrievable. Memories fade, records are lost or corrupted, and the physical landscape changes. Yet investigators persist, guided by the understanding that absence itself can carry meaning, and that the accumulation of insight, however indirect, contributes to understanding. The DNA match, once a source of dramatic revelation, is now a quiet, enduring reminder of both progress and limitation. It anchors the investigation in certainty while simultaneously emphasizing ambiguity. It is proof of presence without narrative, evidence of interaction without context. This duality shapes investigative philosophy. Knowing something is not the same as knowing why it occurred, and proving a connection does not necessarily produce resolution. Throughout the process, investigators confront the human dimension of their work. Emotional fatigue, intellectual tension, and moral responsibility intertwine, reinforcing the understanding that the pursuit of truth is never purely technical. Each step is weighed not only for evidentiary value, but for its impact on memory, perception, and legacy. The case is no longer merely a record of past crime. It is an active participant in the lives of those who engage with it, shaping decisions, framing priorities, and demanding attention across decades. Ultimately, the 1999 disappearance persists as it always has, unresolved, haunting, and instructive. It exists in the interplay of knowledge and uncertainty, presence and absence, investigation and limitation. Investigators continue to engage with it, guided by ethics, evidence, and experience, while the family maintains a quiet vigilance, and the broader community forgets and recalls it intermittently. The cold case, in its enduring ambiguity, embodies both the promise and frustration of criminal investigation. That persistence matters even when closure is not achieved, that witnessing is itself a form of justice, and that some mysteries resist finality, teaching lessons that extend far beyond the resolution of a single event. Even now, as new techniques emerge and each review refines understanding incrementally, the case remains suspended between known and unknown. Its presence persists in files, databases, and memory, shaping not only investigative practice, but the ethical, emotional, and procedural landscape of law enforcement. The 1999 California cold case continues to exist, a reminder that absence can endure, that questions can persist indefinitely, and that the act of looking, even without resolution, remains an essential testament to the human commitment to truth. The 1999 California cold case lives in the margins of time, not fully present yet never absent, a persistent shadow that stretches across decades, influencing investigators, family members, and the faint echoes of a community that remembers in fragments. Each year layers over the previous, not erasing the mystery, but complicating it, adding depth, nuance, and the undeniable weight of what has gone unspoken and unresolved. The passage of time has not diminished the case's power. It has refined it, making every detail more consequential, every witness recollection more fragile, every piece of evidence more precious. Investigators, seasoned by the relentless pace of experience, return to old evidence with a mixture of hope and caution. The original DNA match that once electrified the department has become both guide and constraint, a signal of proximity but not motive, proof without narrative. Laboratories have revisited it multiple times, applying the most advanced techniques in forensic genetics, probabilistic modeling, kinship analysis, even distant familial mapping. Each advancement provides small insights, connections that were invisible before, but never enough to solve the case. The investigators understand now that technology illuminates without concluding, that evidence is a conversation, not a verdict. Mapping the movements of the suspect and related persons has become an intricate, almost obsessive exercise. Every minor anomaly, an unscheduled meeting, a transaction at odd hours, a fleeting presence in a neighborhood, becomes a point of interest. Investigators trace associations that were once dismissed, triangulating relationships, locations, and behaviors across time. Even the smallest inconsistency, someone who forgot a minor detail, an alibi that doesn't perfectly align, becomes a thread to pull. But the threads rarely weave into a coherent narrative. They loop, intersect, and vanish, emphasizing the gaps that define this case. Family engagement remains both a motivator and a reminder of human stakes. They participate quietly, informed by years of disappointment, yet tethered to the slim possibility of clarity. Each contact with the department rekindles the tension between expectation and reality, hope and resignation. Their questions are deliberate, carefully phrased to extract meaningful updates without pressuring the investigators into conjecture. The emotional gravity is palpable in each conversation. The constant negotiation between patience and anguish, between living and remembering. Public attention fluctuates, sparking briefly with media retrospectives or renewed interest in cold cases solved elsewhere. These fleeting moments often generate new information, an overlooked witness, a neighbor's long-buried recollection, a previously unconsidered transaction. But most leads dissolve upon closer scrutiny. Yet even these minor ripples are significant. They demonstrate that memory, perception, and attention are unpredictable, and that even after decades, human observation can yield fresh perspectives. Internally, the case has become emblematic of procedural patience. It is referenced in training, not as a triumph of resolution, but as a model of meticulous documentation, persistent ethical commitment, and cautious engagement with emerging technology. It teaches that some questions must be approached iteratively, with the understanding that evidence is rarely complete and certainty is always provisional. Investigators learn to respect absence, to value what can be inferred without presuming knowledge, and to recognize that the absence of resolution is itself meaningful. Every review of the file reveals layers previously overlooked. Witness statements are reread, timelines reconstructed, minor observations reevaluated. Analysts notice patterns in proximity, associations, and behavior that initially seemed irrelevant, now reframed as potential indicators of opportunity. A neighbor's casual comment, a clerk's recollection of an unusual purchase, an overlooked photograph, all acquire significance through repetition, context, and comparison. Yet the case refuses to yield a definitive narrative. The pattern is always suggestive, rarely conclusive. Ethics and procedure intersect constantly in this ongoing investigation. Investigators must balance potential breakthroughs against privacy concerns, potential reputational harm, and the limitations of evidence. The suspect, though biologically linked through DNA, is neither confirmed as guilty nor fully exonerated. Investigators work carefully, aware that each step has consequences, both for the living and for the memory of the disappeared. This tension underscores the complexity of modern investigation, where science, law, and morality intertwine. The environment itself has shifted over time. Streets have been repaved, buildings demolished, neighborhoods transformed. Locations central to the disappearance have altered, erasing physical context and leaving only records, photographs, and memory. Investigators adapt, combining old records with new data, reconstructing environments digitally or through interviews. They attempt to visualize the past through the lens of the present, aware that every reconstruction is an approximation, a shadow of what actually existed. Emotional endurance defines those who remain committed to the case. Frustration, fatigue, hope, doubt, all coexist, creating a complex psychological landscape. Investigators become attuned to subtle cues, inconsistencies in statements, shifts in demeanor, moments of hesitation that may indicate recollection or concealment. They develop patience not only for the evidence, but for the human actors involved, understanding that perception, memory, and behavior are inherently imperfect. Despite every advancement, every careful review, and every methodical analysis, the 1999 California cold case persists as an enigma. DNA provides connection, evidence offers context, and timelines hint at narrative, but nothing produces closure. The suspect remains present in procedural focus, but absent from certainty. The family lives with the tension between hope and resignation. Investigators endure in the liminal space between what is known and what remains forever uncertain. And so the case continues, suspended in time, a living archive of absence. It shapes procedures, informs ethical practice, and teaches the enduring value of persistence. It exists in the minutiae of forensic notes, in the careful annotations of investigators, in the quiet vigilance of family members, and in the sporadic attention of a public that cannot fully grasp its weight. It is more than a cold case. It is a testament to the endurance of mystery, the limits of knowledge, and the relentless human commitment to seek truth even when the truth refuses to reveal itself. The story of the 1999 disappearance endures as a paradox, tangible and untouchable, illuminated yet obscure, approached yet never fully known. It persists not as resolution, but as process, not as closure, but as ongoing engagement, a reminder that some absences are permanent, some mysteries eternal, and that in the act of persistent searching, those who investigate bear witness to truths that may never be spoken aloud. The 1999 California cold case has long outgrown its origin as a single missing person file. It has become a living chronicle of time, memory, and unresolved tension. The absence of resolution has a presence of its own, shaping the lives of investigators, the family, and even the faint echoes of a community that only occasionally recalls the vanished figure in passing conversation or fleeting news headlines. Every new technology, every novel analytical technique is measured against decades of stagnation and partial progress, a reminder that innovation illuminates but does not necessarily conclude. DNA remains at the heart of the investigation, a precise and cold metric that both anchors and frustrates the case. Advanced forensic tools now allow for probabilistic relationships, genetic triangulation, and minute sequencing that was impossible when the case began. Analysts compare old samples to modern databases, seeking distant relatives, uncovering subtle connections that may suggest indirect involvement. Each insight, however, remains a fragment, a connection without motive, a presence without narrative, a proof without a story. The investigators have learned that evidence can point endlessly without ever completing the circle. Mapping the suspect's behavior has become a complex, almost obsessive art. Investigators retrace movements, reconstruct social interactions, and analyze patterns of work, family, and community engagement. Every minor inconsistency, a missed appointment, a fleeting interaction, a casual comment, receives attention. Even decades-old recollections are reconsidered, their vagueness weighed against corroborative evidence. Yet every pattern is incomplete, every timeline contains holes, and the reconstruction of the event remains provisional, fragile, always subject to revision. The family endures in quiet vigilance. Years of waiting have hardened their patience, but also intensified the subtle anxiety that surfaces with each update. They ask fewer questions now, but every inquiry carries immense emotional weight. Has anything changed? Have you found a new lead? Will we ever know? Investigators respond with tempered honesty, mindful that transparency does not guarantee closure, and that hope must be balanced against the relentless constraints of evidence and law. The tension between expectation and reality permeates each interaction, shaping the emotional landscape of all involved. Public attention is sporadic, flickering in brief waves of media coverage or renewed interest in unsolved crimes. Each resurgence offers the possibility of new information, a witness suddenly remembered, a neighbor motivated to speak, a previously overlooked piece of evidence. But most often these sparks dissipate, leaving the underlying mystery intact. Still, even temporary focus can illuminate forgotten details, challenge assumptions, and renew procedural rigor. Investigators recognize the duality. Public awareness can catalyze leads, but can also amplify pressure, speculation, and distraction. Internally, the case functions as a masterclass in persistence and procedural integrity. It is referenced frequently in training as an example of meticulous record-keeping, the disciplined review of evidence, and the ethical responsibility to pursue truth without assuming resolution. Investigators learn that patience, consistency, and restraint are as important as insight, and that interpreting absence requires as much skill as analyzing presence. The file itself is a testament to human diligence, a layered artifact of annotation, report, and reflection accumulated over decades. Re-examination of witness statements has become an iterative process. Analysts read, reread, and cross-reference every account, seeking alignment or contradiction. Minor observations, a neighbor recalling a car, a clerk remembering a peculiar transaction, a friend's fleeting comment, are all considered with care. Time has altered memory, introducing distortion, but repetition, context, and triangulation provide partial correction. Each detail is weighted against cumulative evidence, but the case continues to resist narrative closure. Connections are suggestive, yet never fully explanatory. Ethical considerations permeate decision-making. Investigators must balance potential breakthroughs against the consequences for privacy, reputation, and legal standards. The suspect, biologically linked but legally unproven, is a figure around which hypotheses pivot, yet whom procedural integrity prevents them from fully confronting. Every step is measured, cautious, deliberate, because the pursuit of justice is inseparable from the principles that guide evidence-based reasoning and the humane treatment of all involved parties. The passage of time has reshaped the physical context of the case. Streets, buildings, and neighborhoods have changed, erasing tangible cues that once informed investigation. Digital reconstructions attempt to approximate the environment of 1999, overlaying archival data with contemporary maps. Investigators visualize the past through a blend of imagination and evidence, aware that every reconstruction is provisional, a partial glimpse of an irretrievable reality. The landscape itself becomes a reminder of impermanence, of memory's fragility, and of the enduring challenge of pursuing absence. Emotional endurance is essential. Investigators manage frustration, fatigue, hope, and doubt in a delicate balance, each emotion shaping analytical decisions and interpretive frameworks. They recognize the subtle cues in statements, behavior, and circumstance, understanding that human memory is imperfect and behavior often conceals as much as it reveals. Each observation is interpreted within a complex web of context, probability, and precedent, highlighting the multidimensional nature of long-term investigation. Despite decades of work, the 1999 California disappearance remains unresolved. DNA provides connection, but not narrative. Evidence suggests involvement, but not intent, and patterns hint at sequence, but never certainty. The suspect remains tangible, yet distant. The family attentive, yet unfulfilled. The community aware, yet intermittently engaged. The case persists in the liminal space between knowledge and mystery, shaping investigative philosophy and professional ethics as much as procedural outcomes. Ultimately, the cold case is more than a missing person file. It is a living testament to endurance, reflection, and the limits of human understanding. It exists in departmental records, in laboratory archives, in careful annotations, and in the quiet vigilance of those who refuse to let it fade. Its presence shapes decisions, informs training, and serves as a continuous reminder that some absences endure indefinitely, that some questions resist resolution, and that the act of investigation itself, persistent, ethical, and meticulous, is a form of justice, even when final answers remain forever beyond reach. The 1999 case continues to occupy the intersection of presence and absence, certainty and ambiguity, time and memory. It persists in files, minds, and hearts, a story of unresolved disappearance that teaches more about the human condition, investigative perseverance, and ethical responsibility than any solved case could. It is in every sense alive, unresolved, haunting, instructive, and enduring, a testament to the relentless pursuit of truth in the face of enduring mystery.